The streets were quiet, almost too quiet for a late afternoon, the kind of silence that lingers, hanging in the air like a question no one has the answer to. A tall black SUV rolled down a deserted road in the outskirts of the city. Behind the wheel were two young men, twins, identical in every way except for the slight difference in their expressions. Their eyes locked on the road ahead, unaware that today, this ordinary drive would change everything. Out of nowhere, the flashing red and blue lights of a police cruiser lit up the rearview mirror. Without hesitation, the twins pulled over to the side of the road. A quiet sigh escaped one of them as they exchanged glances, already anticipating what this stop would be about. Both knew how these encounters often played out, especially when they were driving alone. As the officer approached the vehicle, he noticed something odd. The twins had already rolled down the windows, as if they'd been expecting this moment. The officer, young and alert, glanced from one twin to the other, but it wasn't their looks or their age that caught his attention. It was something else, something he wasn't prepared for, something that made him hesitate. He took a step closer, peering into the backseat of the SUV. What he saw there froze him in place. His hand lingered on his holster for just a moment, a quiet wave of uncertainty washing over him. What he was seeing didn't make sense. The kind of thing he never thought he'd encounter in a quiet neighborhood like this one. Then, without warning, the officer reached for his radio. His voice was steady, but urgent, as he called for backup. "Code Red, I need immediate support. Lock down the entire street," he commanded. The calm before the storm shattered, the tension in the air thick enough to cut with a knife. The twins, sensing the change, sat up straighter in their seats, their faces betraying a mix of confusion and fear. But why would a simple traffic stop escalate like this? Why did the officer feel the need to lock down the entire street, drawing attention from every corner of the neighborhood? Was this just an overreaction, or was there something far deeper at play? The officer's eyes never left the back seat, his mind racing to process what he had just witnessed. Whatever he had seen in that car was enough to stop him in his tracks. The air was thick with anticipation as the distant sound of sirens grew louder. The twins, now fully aware of the shift in the situation, could only wonder, was this a case of mistaken identity, or had they unknowingly become part of something much larger? The officer's cold gaze was fixed on them, and for the first time, they didn't know what to say or do. But the truth of what was happening, and what was about to happen next, was far beyond anything either of them could have anticipated. And that's where the story begins. Stick around, because you won't believe what happens next. The sirens grew louder, echoing down the empty street as the officer's hand never left the radio. He had called in a code red, which was reserved for situations that didn't just involve a simple traffic violation or a routine stop. It was for those rare, heart-stopping moments when something didn't add up, when the stakes were higher than they seemed. But what was it about these twins that had set off this alarm? Back in the SUV, the twins exchanged another glance, this time with more urgency. Jamal, the older twin by mere minutes, reached for the ignition to turn off the engine, but something stopped him. There was a subtle shift in the air, like the whole world had slowed down, and every decision from this moment onward would be crucial. The tension was so thick, they could almost taste it. His brother, Malik, tightened his grip on the door handle, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror, to the officer who still hadn't spoken a word. The twins had grown up in this neighborhood. They knew these streets, the way the houses lined up, the cracked sidewalks, and even the way the trees swayed in the wind. They had spent years driving these roads without incident, without fear. But today was different. They were alone, yes, but the situation felt wrong. like there was something they weren't being told. What was so dangerous about them? About their car? Jamal looked over at Malik, who was still staring at the officer's rigid stance. "What do you think this is about?" he whispered, as though speaking louder might somehow make things worse. Malik didn't answer immediately. His eyes were locked on the officer's every move. There was a coldness about the way the officer had stepped up to the car, the way he had studied them. But it wasn't just suspicion. It was something deeper, something that gnawed at Malik's gut. Then the officer spoke. "Step out of the vehicle." The command was direct, but the tone was different now. There was a subtle shift in the officer's voice, as though he was trying to keep his own emotions in check. Jamal and Malik shared one more fleeting glance before both slowly opened their doors and stepped out onto the cold asphalt. The officer's eyes flicked nervously between them as they stood, both towering over him. Yet their bodies were tense, their every movement careful. "Put your hands where I can see them." They complied without hesitation. "I need to know what's in that back seat," the officer said, finally breaking the silence. His voice wavered, but there was an urgency there, something that neither Jamal nor Malik could ignore. The twins hadn't noticed it before, but now in the officer's eyes, they saw a flicker of fear. It was a strange thing to see in someone who was supposed to be the one in control. "What's in the back seat?" Malik echoed, his voice low and steady. "What's the problem, officer?" The officer hesitated. "It's not what you think." He paused again, his voice cracking slightly. "It's what's in the back seat that I can't explain." Jamal felt his chest tighten as he slowly turned toward the SUV. What had been sitting in the back for the entire drive? He had no idea, not until the officer had pointed it out. The two of them had been driving to a local event, a food truck festival they had been excited about for weeks. They'd packed up their gear, snacks, and drinks for the long day ahead, but everything had been so normal until now. The officer motioned to his radio. "We need backup now." Jamal glanced over his shoulder to see the flashing lights growing closer. "Backup? What's going on here?" His voice had grown more frantic, a mix of confusion and rising panic. "We're just two guys out for a drive. Why are you locking down the street? We don't know what you've brought into the area," the officer finally admitted, his voice low and urgent. "We need to know what's in that back seat now." It was then that the real panic started to set in. Not just for the twins, but for everyone in the neighborhood. Within moments, another squad car pulled up, and then another. The street, once empty and quiet, was now filled with police vehicles, each one arriving with lights flashing and officers spilling out into the scene. Jamal's pulse quickened as he took a step closer to the officer. "What's in the back seat? What do you mean what we brought into the area?" "We're just stay calm," the officer interrupted, his eyes darting nervously. "Please, just stay calm." With a quick motion, the officer turned toward the SUV and opened the back door. What he saw made his stomach twist. The twins hadn't noticed it before, but there, lying across the back seat, was something neither of them had expected. Something that looked out of place. Something too foreign to ignore. But before the officer could fully react, something shifted again. The air became charged, and the sound of approaching sirens heightened. The officer was frozen, his breath shallow, his mind scrambling to process what he was seeing. Whatever was in that back seat had just shifted the entire course of the situation, and with it, the fate of everyone involved. The tension had reached a boiling point. The officer's hand was trembling as he radioed in a fresh command. "Full lockdown. I need every available unit here now." And in that moment, Jamal and Malik knew they were no longer just caught in a random traffic stop. The world they had known was slipping away, and they were in the middle of something much bigger, much more dangerous than they could have ever imagined. The street was no longer theirs. The danger was closing in, and neither of them knew how it would end. The sirens continued to wail in the distance, growing louder, closer. The officer's eyes flicked nervously back and forth between the twins, and for a split second, Jamal saw something in his gaze. Fear. Not just fear of the unknown, but a realization that whatever had been in that backseat was something far bigger than any of them had imagined. The officer's hand trembled slightly as he reached for his radio again, his voice shaky. "We need a full containment of the area. I don't care what it takes." Jamal felt his heart race as he glanced back at Malik. They had been expecting nothing more than a quick chat, maybe a ticket for speeding. But instead, everything had escalated to this, something far darker, something neither of them had ever imagined. The twins exchanged a silent glance, their bond stronger than ever, now the only thing holding them together. Malik's voice cut through the tension, barely above a whisper. "What the hell is going on?" Before Jamal could answer, a voice cut through the chaos. A new officer had arrived on the scene. His uniform was different, marked with the insignia of a special unit, one that wasn't usually seen in this neighborhood. He marched straight toward the officer who had stopped them, a sense of urgency in every step, without even acknowledging. The twins, the new officer, turned his attention to the backseat of the SUV. "What have we got?" he asked, his voice calm but forceful. The first officer stepped back, motioning toward the car. "You need to see for yourself. I don't know how to explain it." The new officer crouched next to the SUV, peering inside, and then froze. For a moment, no one moved. The tension in the air was palpable as everyone waited for him to say something, anything, to explain why this was happening. Finally, he straightened up, his face pale. "Get them out of here, now," he snapped. And the command was so abrupt, so forceful, that it left no room for questioning. Jamal's head was spinning. "What's going on? What's in the backseat?" But the officer didn't answer. Instead, pulling out a pair of handcuffs and gently placing them on Jamal's wrists. "You're both going to be fine. Just do as we say." The twins were escorted to another police vehicle, where they were sat down and left in a holding area. They were told nothing. No explanation, no reason for the sudden lockdown, no clue as to what had really happened. But as the minutes ticked by, the world outside continued to unfold. And it wasn't until the evening news started flashing the words, "Breaking news, major police investigation underway," that they finally understood the gravity of the situation. The backseat of their SUV hadn't contained drugs, weapons, or any kind of illegal substance. No, it had contained something far more dangerous. A box, seemingly unremarkable, but one that had been tied to a series of high-profile disappearances. It had been left unnoticed, quietly sitting in the back seat during their entire drive, only now coming into focus as a critical piece of a much larger puzzle. That box, which had once seemed so innocuous, held the answers to a terrifying conspiracy, a network that had infiltrated places Jamal and Malik had never even thought to look. It connected them to a chain of events that were far beyond their control. It turned out that the officer who had stopped them wasn't just reacting to a suspicious vehicle. He had been part of a much bigger operation, one that had been tracking down the box for weeks. In the end, the twins were cleared of any wrongdoing. Their involvement was purely by chance, a twist of fate that had pulled them into a world they couldn't have imagined. The officer, who had locked down the street in a desperate attempt to protect them and the community, was hailed as a hero. But for Jamal and Malik, the moment was a blur, an event that had shifted their understanding of the world around them. As they were released and the case continued, the realization settled in. There were forces at play, ones that weren't just about traffic stops and speeding tickets, and sometimes, even the smallest thing, a wrong turn, a forgotten box, could change everything. The street, which had been filled with tension and uncertainty, slowly began to return to normal. The flashing lights faded into the distance, and the quiet hum of the city returned.